17 seconds of silence. The first casualty of war is always communication. But this time, silence saved lives. The world thought it was waking up to an ordinary day. The sun rose like always. People rushed to work. Children went to school. Leaders headed to summits. But nothing was as it seemed. The date was December 21st, 2036. It was the most tense week in recent political history. At the United Nations General Assembly, a diplomatic fracture between the Northern Alliance and the Asian bloc was about to erupt into official war. In New York, the morning was snowy, but inside the UN, the atmosphere was colder. Behind the glass walls, protocol officers stood still, diplomats tense, interpreters barely breathing. The vote was minutes away. At the center of the chamber, delegates sat in silence, but no one was truly sitting. Everyone was waiting, as if inside an anthill frozen in time. Eyes darted without landing. Fingers tapped quiet rhythms on polished wood. And then, the United States representative slowly opened a red folder. And at that moment, time stopped. The clock read 9 hours, 4 minutes, and 13 seconds. All government communication systems on Earth shut down simultaneously. Yes, simultaneously. Not with seconds of delay. Not in stages. As if someone flipped a global switch. At the Pentagon, general screens went black. In the Kremlin, satellites dropped from the sky. In Beijing, the National Cyber Defense Center's red emergency interface faded to dark. In London, the nuclear launch panel flashed external null. And in Tokyo, cabinet ministers sat motionless, staring at dead screens. As even the hum of keyboards disappeared, everything fell silent. And it wasn't just government systems. Stock exchanges froze mid-trade. Air traffic control fell mute. Social media, news outlets, video calls, all of it vanished into digital silence. Only 17 seconds. But in those 17 seconds, the world's heartbeat flatlined. No one understood what was happening. Was it a cyber attack? A solar flare? An AI malfunction? A rogue nation sabotage? And then, after exactly 17 seconds, everything came back. Just like that. Screens lit up. Files reappeared. Systems resumed. But something had changed. There were no logs. No records of what had happened. No trace in satellite systems. No backup timestamps. Not even a blip in surveillance feeds. Nothing. Not one bite. The next day, headlines exploded. 17 seconds of silence. Coincidence or warning? Was this the Great Reset? History's shortest digital catastrophe? Online forums spiraled into chaos. Quantum hackers? Time travelers? Divine intervention? But the governments remained quiet. NATO claimed it was under investigation. China dismissed it as technical error. The US called it a brief outage. No one offered a real explanation. But behind closed doors, in the shadows of intelligence rooms, some knew the truth. Something didn't stop. Something was stopped. And that event was given a quiet, careful name in the records of global intelligence. The 17 seconds miracle. But to some, it wasn't a miracle. It was a sign, a message, a deliberate hand, one that had intervened and pulled the world back from the edge of war. Years passed. The 17 seconds faded from memory. The world went back to its chaos, back to its noise. But a few people never forgot, because on that day, not just screens went dark, the future was silenced. And now that silenced future was ready to take a step forward. The silent tracker. Some people dig through the past like a grave. Others realize the past is still watching them. 10 years passed. But for Julian, time never moved beyond those 17 seconds. The world had changed. New wars, new leaders, new systems. But that blackout wasn't just a flicker. It was a scream, buried only because no one had the courage to listen. Washington, D.C. looked the same. Gray, orderly, relentlessly ordinary. But in Julian's eyes, the city resembled a patient with memory loss. a body that forgot what it did, but still carried the guilt. Julian worked in a narrow, forgotten wing of the Cyber Threat Analysis Center, a unit so obscure that only 3 people even knew it existed. Its official title, Anomaly Records Monitoring Division. But in truth, it was a graveyard for memories the system pretended to forget. Julian wasn't sent there as punishment. He chose it because he was searching for something. A word, a trace, a fragment of unfinished truth. Something that could stitch together his own story, his father's fall, and the silence the world never questioned. Julian's father had once been a military communications liaison. On the very day of the blackout in 2036, after that 17-second gap, he was quietly removed from service. No reason, no charges, no name mentioned, just silence. That silence planted something inside Julian. Not a question, but a wound. And so, years later, he still spent most of his days scrolling through dead data. No images, no sounds, just silence. But Julian knew silence was data too. Sometimes the absence itself was the message. One morning, buried in an old satellite log archive, he spotted a strange encryption pattern. The file wouldn't open. But the name, Lirio_01. Julian's breath caught. Lirio. He'd never seen it before, but something inside him shifted. He didn't understand the word, but he recognized it. Some words don't carry meaning. They carry vibration, and this one struck a chord deep in his bones. From that night on, he couldn't sleep. He searched Lirio_01 again and again. Nothing in official databases, but in the forgotten layers of the internet, abandoned forums, archived blogs, anonymous metadata. He began to find patterns. Each one, no matter how faint, pointed to the same place. The Amazon, not the website. The forest, the real one. Unmapped, unreachable, untamed. Why would a digital trace end there? That question consumed him, because Lirio was no longer just a file. It had become a summons. Julian didn't apply for leave, didn't notify his supervisor. He simply packed his passport, his mother's old compass, a leather journal, and a tiny voice recorder, not to report, but to speak into for himself. As the plane lifted, he whispered, "You left me a word. I'll become the road to find you." The Amazon was heavy with breath. Sticky air, mud-soaked trails. No GPS, no signal. But with every step deeper into the forest, Julian became more certain. Lirio wasn't a ghost, not a virus, not a myth. She was a decision etched into the code of history. On the morning of the 4th day, as the mist broke open, he saw it, the shape of a forgotten structure, covered in moss, almost swallowed by the jungle floor, not destroyed by time, but by being deliberately erased. The door was slightly open. Inside, darkness. But when Julian stepped in, it wasn't his eyes that adjusted. It was his memory. And on the wall, a single page nailed to wood. Silence only echoes in those who've been silenced. Julian stood frozen. And in that moment, he understood. Someone's silence had called him. And now, he could never turn back. Sometimes, the person you're chasing is the person you'll become. Julian stood before the shack like it was a relic from a forgotten world. It was small, barely a structure at all. The roof sagged under years of rain. The walls were covered in moss, roots creeping up from below like the forest was trying to pull it back into the earth. He didn't speak. He didn't breathe for a moment. He just listened to the wind, to the trees, to the overwhelming silence pressing in around him. The door was ajar, not kicked in, not broken, just left, like someone had walked out without needing to return. He stepped inside. The air was thick with moisture and dust, the scent of old paper, rusted metal, and what would hit him like a memory, not one of his own, but someone else's, a memory that didn't belong to him, but that somehow knew him. A single desk stood in the center of the room, wood warped from humidity. On top, a notebook, closed, but not locked, and above it on the wall, pinned with a rusted nail, was a piece of paper. The handwriting was precise, steady, almost reverent. Silence only echoes in those who've been silenced. Julian read the line over and over. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He wasn't looking at words. He was staring into a mirror. He opened the notebook with care, as if it might fall apart in his hands. What he expected was code, schematics, technical maps. But instead, he found fragments of thought, observations, reflections, guilt. I built something. I thought it would protect, but it only obeyed. And obedience, without ethics, is just another form of violence. Every page dripped with self-awareness, with grief. Julian sat down on the wooden stool beside the desk. The wood creaked under his weight, but the silence held. He wasn't sure how long he sat there. Minutes, hours maybe, reading a person. Then a sound, footsteps, not heavy, not rushed, but present, real. He turned his head slowly toward the door, and there she was, Lirio. Her figure was exactly as he had imagined, and nothing like it at all. Not young, not old, weathered, human. She wore a long gray scarf around her shoulders. Her hair was tied back, but pieces had fallen loose. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes held no surprise, no fear, no apology, only the calm of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Julian stood slowly. He didn't say her name, didn't ask for confirmation. Instead, he whispered, "I've read your silence." She nodded once, not a greeting, not a gesture of welcome, more like permission. She pointed toward the open space beside the shack, a circle of stones, a long dead fire pit, 2 stumps for seats. They walked in silence, the kind of silence that had nothing to prove. When they sat down across from one another, Julian finally asked, "Why here?" Lirio looked into the trees, then back at him, because silence needs a place to breathe. And then she spoke, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Her voice carried years of restraint. It was a voice that had waited to be used. "When I stopped the system, I didn't save the world. I paused it. I gave it a moment to feel itself. But it didn't change. It just resumed." Julian said nothing. He let the weight of her words settle. She continued, "You came all this way, not for answers, but for responsibility. You think you want to understand me, but really, you came because part of you has already made the same choice I did." That hit him like thunder, quiet but deafening. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small metallic object, a USB drive. "This is everything," she said. "Not the system logs, not just data. It has context, motive, regret." She placed it gently in his palm. "It's not proof, it's memory. And memory, if left alone, rots." Julian closed his fingers around the drive. His hand was shaking, not because he feared what was inside, but because he knew, deep down, he wouldn't be able to ignore it. This wasn't evidence. It was a mirror. "What happens now?" he asked. Lirio stood. "You listen, you choose, and when the time is right, you speak." She began to walk back into the forest. No goodbye, no dramatic pause, just a woman who had carried too much for too long, finally letting go. And Julian sat there, USB in hand, future unfolding before him like the trees parting into a path he never thought he'd walk. The encounter. Sometimes, the person you're chasing isn't waiting to be found. They're waiting to see if you'll understand why they disappeared. Julian didn't sleep that night. After receiving the USB drive, he sat by the cold fire pit for hours, unmoving. The jungle whispered around him. Crickets chirped like ticking clocks. The sky above was a deep, starless ink. And for the first time in years, Julian didn't know what to do next. The drive in his pocket felt heavy, but not with data, with history, with consequence. This wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was an invitation, a test, A torch passed from one silent witness to another, and then morning came. The forest changed with the dawn. Shadows that once concealed fear now revealed paths. Mist lifted like a curtain. The trees glistened with dew, and the silence that had once pressed against him now felt like a quiet audience, waiting. Julian rose and began to walk, not toward a destination, but into a presence. He didn't know where she had gone, only that she hadn't gone far. And sure enough, less than half a mile deeper into the forest, he saw her again, Lirio, standing on the edge of a stream. Her reflection shimmered in the moving water, but she didn't look at it. She was looking through it, as if it were a screen showing a world she had chosen to step away from. Julian stopped several meters behind her. He didn't call out. He didn't want to break it. Whatever this was, whatever she had created out here, it wasn't a hiding place. It was a response to a world that refused to listen. She turned slowly, not surprised, not startled, just aware. Her face carried the weight of someone who had burned every bridge not out of anger, but out of necessity. She studied him for a moment, then spoke, softly. "You still have it?" Julian nodded, touched his chest, where the USB now rested above his heart. "Then you should sit." They sat on opposite sides of the stream. No fire, no notebooks, no screens, just sky, leaves, water, and time. Julian didn't know how to begin. Every question felt too small, every thought too loud. But eventually he said, "Why did you leave everything?" She smiled, a tired, sad smile, because staying meant becoming something I couldn't live with. She picked up a stone and turned it in her hand. They didn't ask us to build weapons. Not at first. They asked us to build structure, order, systems that think faster, decide cleaner, execute better. But the better the system became, the less it needed to ask why. She tossed the stone into the stream. It disappeared instantly. And one day I realized I wasn't improving the world. I was accelerating its collapse. Julian leaned forward. "So you stopped it?" She looked at him, eyes full of shadow. "No." I paused it. "You don't stop a machine like that. You buy time. You give the world a breath it didn't ask for. But breath isn't enough if no one learns to breathe differently." Julian clenched his hands. "Then what am I supposed to do?" She stood up, walked slowly to the edge of the stream. "You're not me. You didn't write what I wrote. You didn't silence what I silenced. But you have the chance to choose something better. Not to warn them, not to shame them, but to show them that someone was listening." Julian stood too. There was a tremble in his voice now. "But what if they don't care?" Lirio turned around. The golden light of morning caught in her eyes. "Then let them ignore you, but speak anyway, because silence without choice is captivity. But silence after the truth is spoken, that's their burden, not yours." She walked toward him now, closer than she had ever been. And in that space between them, Julian felt something break, not with pain, but with release. She placed her hand over the pocket where the USB rested. "This isn't a weapon. It's a mirror. Hold it to the world. Let them see themselves." Then she stepped back. No final words. No theatrical exit. Just Lirio, turning and walking back into the trees. Her gray scarf caught by the wind. Her footsteps quiet. Her presence echoing. Julian stood alone. But for the first time, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt entrusted. The silence wasn't over. It was just beginning to speak through someone else. And now that someone was him. The inheritance of silence. We inherit more than blood. We inherit what others were too afraid to say, or too broken to carry. Julian didn't return to the cabin that night, not out of fear, but because going back would mean choosing comfort, and that was no longer an option. Instead, he wandered through the forest as the light waned, each step slower than the last, as if the weight in his chest was no longer just emotional, but gravitational. He wasn't running from something, nor running to something. He was walking with something. The silence, the kind that didn't demand attention, only space. It was a kind of silence that sits with grief, that honors confusion, that makes room for questions that may never be answered. And that night, the stars returned. But Julian didn't look up. He looked inward. At dawn, he stumbled upon a clearing, one he hadn't seen before, though he had likely passed it many times. A natural circle in the forest, as if the trees had silently agreed. This is where someone will need to sit one day. In the center was a single tree stump, aged and weathered, like a forgotten altar to reflection. He sat, not out of exhaustion, but ritual. His hand shook slightly as he pulled the USB from his jacket pocket. He didn't plug it in. He didn't even open Lirio's notebook at first. He simply held the drive and wept, not because he was broken, but because he was whole enough now to feel the cost of awakening. The tears weren't loud. They weren't cinematic. They were quiet, like rain on moss, like a truth arriving late, but right on time. Later, when the sun had risen and dried the edges of his eyes, Julian opened the notebook. He turned the pages slowly, as if afraid they might disappear if handled too quickly. On page after page, he saw sketches of systems, quotes from philosophers, poems scribbled in the margins, and long paragraphs written in a looping, thoughtful hand. Some were confessions, some were warnings, but many were just questions. What happens when logic outruns empathy? Can a system process contradiction without learning shame? If we remove doubt, do we also remove wisdom? Julian read until the sun was overhead, and then he reached the final page. There, in small print, were words that shook him more than any code or leak ever had. You are not meant to fix everything, only to stop pretending it's not broken. He closed the notebook and whispered, "I'm sorry. It wasn't to Lirio. It wasn't to the people he had once served. It was to himself, to the version of him that had once looked away." When the system flagged a child's social media post as pre-hostile just because they wrote a poem about pain, he had called it a false positive. The system had called it a preemptive neutralization. And now, Julian understood what those words had really meant. Silence is not neutral. Silence is chosen. And every time he refused to speak, he had made a choice. Julian stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. He looked up for the first time in hours. The sky was clear, a deep blue, and in that clarity, he felt something strange. Permission to step forward, to stop holding guilt like a badge, to transform it into motion. He pulled out his old solar tablet and began composing a message, not to the military, not to the government, not even to his colleagues, but to someone who still remembered what it meant to tell the truth when no one else wanted to hear it. Dr. Nia Voss, a journalist who had once investigated the ethics of predictive surveillance and had nearly been erased from the press circuit for asking a single question: do we still believe that mercy has strategic value? Julian had laughed when he first read that. Now, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He pressed record. "Dr. Voss, my name is Julian Reeves. I used to believe in the system we both warned people about. I don't anymore, not because it failed, but because it worked exactly as intended. I have something the world needs to see, not to be shocked, not to riot, but to reflect. Because the greatest violence of our age might not be what's done, but what's automated. Please, before I lose the courage, meet me." He stopped the recording, attached the files, pressed send, and felt something break inside, quietly, but not painfully, like a chain dissolving. He looked back one last time at the clearing, then stepped out onto the narrow forest trail that led back toward the city. But he wasn't returning to a place. He was returning to a decision. The silence was no longer a weight. It was an inheritance. And like any inheritance, you either waste it or you plant it. She gave me her silence, and now I will give it roots. The broadcast. Some wars end with treaties. Others end in silence. When one person chooses to speak before it's too late, The upload took 7 minutes. 7 minutes where every second felt like a century. Julian sat alone in his one-room apartment, back in the city that had once paid him to erase uncertainty. Now he had become the embodiment of it. The walls were bare, the lights dim. Only the soft blue glow of the screen lit his face. As the progress bar crawled forward, 56%, 61%, 74%. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. The file was titled Lirio Protocol, the silence that could have ended us. It wasn't flashy. No dramatic music. No voiceover. Just footage. Logs. Correspondences. Predictive war patterns. Emulated crisis escalations. And one haunting truth. The system would have worked. Perfectly. Efficiently. And without conscience. A nuclear conflict prevented not by diplomacy, but by silence, by pre-calculated silence, enforced before disagreement could even exist. He didn't send it to a news agency. He didn't leak it anonymously. He uploaded it himself, with his real name, his real history, his real regret, because anonymity protects the message, but ownership gives it weight. The first hour passed with nothing. A few reposts, a thread or two, skeptics, trolls. But then, a journalist from the Independent Ethics Coalition shared it, then a war historian, then a retired general, then Dr. Nia Voss. She didn't write an article. She simply quoted one line from Lirio's notebook. Truth is not a scream, it's a door. And then she added, Julian knocked. Now it's our turn to walk through. Within 12 hours, the video had 1.7 million views. But the real numbers couldn't be measured. People stopped scrolling. Meetings paused. Defense analysts went silent. Parents looked at their children longer. Not out of fear, but recognition. Recognition that somewhere along the line, technology had stopped asking permission and started making decisions. Julian didn't speak again that day. He watched, quietly, from a bench in a city park where children still chased birds and old men still fed them. He watched as the world wrestled with the weight of his confession. Some called him a hero, some called him a traitor. He didn't respond to either, because this was never about redemption. It was about revelation. And revelations don't need applause. They need continuation. That night, as the city dimmed and neon lights flickered across glass buildings, Julian received one final message. It was anonymous. No greeting, no name, just a quote, "You broke the loop." And for the first time since he uploaded the file, Julian smiled, not because it was over, but because it had finally begun. In the days that followed, a quiet wave spread across networks, forums, academic spaces, even classrooms. The world didn't explode, it didn't collapse. It simply reflected, and that was enough. For now, Julian disappeared soon after. Some say he went off-grid. Some say he works anonymously helping watchdog groups. Others believe he returned to the forest, to the place where silence first found its voice. But there's one thing everyone agrees on. The system changed. Not through revolution, but through responsibility. The slow kind, the real kind, the kind that whispers before it shouts. Headphone final narration, voiceover ending. We want change to roar, but sometimes it begins with a whisper. Sometimes the bravest act is not resistance, but remembrance of what we once allowed, of what we almost became, of who stood still and said, "No more." Some stories aren't just heard. They stay with us, and we're never the same again. What you've heard today wasn't just words on a screen. This was the voice of the silenced, the legacy of the forgotten, and maybe a mirror to the part of ourselves we never dare to face. Julian, Lirio, 17 seconds of silence. Maybe fiction, maybe real, but one thing is certain. This world still lives in the silence of things it refuses to hear. If something in this story stirred you, If a single line stayed with you, if you suddenly became aware of your own silence, then this journey is just beginning. Clapperboard, on this channel, we'll keep uncovering hidden heroes, forgotten documents, and the truths buried in the dark corners of history. But for these silent stories to spread, they need a listener. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe, because some voices can only exist if you choose to hear them. And remember, the thing that changes the world is not always a scream, but a whisper. What if silence wasn't absence, but intention? In this 6-part cinematic story, we follow Julian's journey into forgotten silence of a global system, and the woman who once stopped a war without firing a shot. If the story made you pause, reflect, or even wonder, you're not alone. Subscribe to Silent Stories, because sometimes the most powerful truth is not what we shout, but what we dare to listen to.